Democracy in its purest theoretical form is a bloodless mechanism for revolution. It is the agreement that the power of the state will shift not by the barrel of a gun, but by the overwhelming arithmetic of the ballot box. But history is littered with the corpses of democracies that threaten the survival of an entrenched military elite. When the polls closed in Pakistan on December 7, 1970, the geopolitical tectonic plates of the subcontinent violently snapped. The survivors of the Bhola cyclone, marching through the mud and grief, had delivered a mandate so absolute it defied the calculations of every intelligence agency in Islamabad. Sheikh Mujibur Rahman's Awami League did not just win the election, they completely eradicated their political opposition in the east. They secured 160 out of the 162 allocated provincial seats. By the sheer weight of population demographics, this gave the Awami League an absolute unassailable majority in the National Assembly of Pakistan. Legally, constitutionally and democratically, the men who had been treated as second-class citizens, the people who had been economically bled to build the modern boulevards of the West, were now the rulers of the entire nation. Sheikh Mujib was the Prime Minister-elect. The capital of political power had instantly shifted 1,000 miles across the Indian landmass from Islamabad to Dhaka. For the military junta and the feudal elite of West Pakistan, this was not an election result. It was an existential crisis. They were faced with a binary choice: surrender the empire to the very people they had subjugated, or burn the democratic process to the ground. They chose the fire. To understand the political paralysis of early 1971, one must look at the deeply fractured geography of the mandate. While Mujib swept the east, he won 0 seats in the west. Conversely, the flamboyant, aggressively ambitious Zulfikar Ali Bhutto and his Pakistan People's Party secured a dominant 81 seats in West Pakistan, but not a single seat in the east. The election perfectly mirrored the physical reality of the nation. 2 entirely separate countries, holding 2 entirely separate mandates, trapped inside the borders of a single state. Bhutto, representing the entrenched West Pakistani establishment, categorically refused to sit in opposition to a Bengali government. The thought of Mujib enacting his 6-point demand, which would effectively strip Islamabad of the wealth generated by the Eastern Jute, was considered an act of national suicide by the military brass. Bhutto famously threatened his own party members, declaring he would break the legs of any West Pakistani politician who dared to travel to Dhaka to attend the inaugural session of the National Assembly. General Yahya Khan, caught between his promise of a democratic transition and the absolute refusal of the West Pakistani power structure to yield, blinked. On March 1, 1971, in a brief, sterile radio broadcast that would effectively seal the fate of a united Pakistan, Yahya Khan announced the indefinite postponement of the National Assembly. He cited the political deadlock as his justification. Dhaka, the broadcast did not cause panic. It caused an explosion. The illusion of a peaceful transition shattered instantly. The Bengalis realized that the democratic process had been a farce, a game they were allowed to play only as long as they were guaranteed to lose. The moment they won, the board was violently flipped. The streets of Dhaka, Chittagong and Sylhet erupted. Students, workers and lawyers poured out of their homes. They tore down the flags of Pakistan and burned them in the streets. The political struggle for autonomy had officially died. The struggle for national liberation had begun. The military junta expected riots. They expected unorganized, chaotic violence that could be easily crushed with curfews and tear gas. What they faced instead was a terrifying display of absolute, disciplined civil disobedience. Sheikh Mujibur Rahman called for a non-cooperation movement, and the entirety of East Pakistan simply stopped functioning for the regime in Islamabad. The mechanism of the state froze. Government officials refused to go to their offices. Judges refused to sit in the high courts. The trains stopped running. The ports refused to load cargo destined for the West. Even the Bengali cooks and servants working in the luxurious cantonments of the West Pakistani military officers walked off the job. For all intents and purposes, the writ of the Pakistani government ceased to exist in the east. The true capital of the province was no longer the governor's house. It was a modest, two-story residential home at Dhanmondi 32, the residence of Sheikh Mujib. He was running a parallel government, issuing directives that were followed with religious fervor by 70 million people. The tension reached its absolute zenith on March 7, 1971. Over a million people gathered at the Ramna Racecourse ground in Dhaka. They carried bamboo sticks, anticipating an immediate military crackdown. The air was thick with the heat of the approaching spring and the suffocating weight of history. When Sheikh Mujib took the stage, he delivered a speech that was entirely unscripted, a masterful, dangerous tightrope walk between declaring immediate independence and leaving a microscopic window open for a political settlement. His voice, booming and rough, echoed across the sea of humanity. He laid out the history of Bengali suffering, the blood spilled on the streets since 1952, and the betrayal of the election. And then he delivered the words that would become the genesis code of a new nation. The struggle this time is for our emancipation. The struggle this time is for our independence. He told the people to turn every house into a fortress. It was a declaration of war without the official paperwork. The military intelligence officers monitoring the speech from the edges of the crowd took frantic notes, relaying to Islamabad that East Pakistan was lost. To take it back, politics would no longer suffice. It would require an occupation. On March 15, General Yahya Khan flew to Dhaka. He was joined days later by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. To the international press, this was framed as a frantic 11th hour diplomatic mission to save the country. They met with Mujib at the president's house in Dhaka for days of intense closed-door negotiations regarding the constitutional framework of the 6 points. But the negotiations were an elaborate deadly fiction. They were a smokescreen designed to buy time for logistics. While Yahya smiled for the cameras and shook Mujib's hand, the skies over the Indian landmass were thick with the drone of jet engines. Because India had banned Pakistani military flights over its airspace following a politically charged hijacking incident earlier that year, Pakistan International Airlines commercial Boeing 707s were being flown from West Pakistan all the way south to the tip of Sri Lanka and up to Dhaka. The passengers were not civilians. They were thousands of West Pakistani combat troops dressed in civilian clothes, heavily armed and filtering quietly into the cantonments under the cover of darkness. Simultaneously, the MV SWAT, a massive naval transport ship, docked at the port of Chittagong. Its cargo holds were packed with thousands of tons of heavy ammunition and weaponry destined for the military garrisons. When Bengali dock workers realized what was inside, they formed a human blockade, flatly refusing to unload the weapons that they knew would soon be turned against their own families. The military responded by firing into the crowd, initiating the first real bloodshed of the month. To command this massive military buildup, Yahya Khan appointed Lieutenant General Tika Khan as the governor of East Pakistan. Tika Khan was a man known within military circles for his absolute unblinking brutality in crushing insurgencies in Balochistan. He was not sent to Dhaka to negotiate. He was sent to amputate. By March 24th, the troop buildup was complete. The logistical pieces were perfectly arranged on the board. The facade of diplomacy had served its purpose. On the evening of March 25, 1971, the negotiations abruptly ended. Without a public statement, General Yahya Khan quietly boarded a flight out of Dhaka under extreme secrecy. Before his plane even touched the tarmac in Karachi, the orders were given to Tika Khan. The code word was issued. Operation Searchlight was a go. Operation Searchlight was not a riot control measure. It was a meticulously planned, devastatingly precise military decapitation strike designed to crush the Bengali nationalist movement in a single overwhelming night of terror. The objective was to eliminate the Awami League leadership, neutralize the armed Bengali elements within the police and the East Pakistan Rifles, and ruthlessly purge the intellectual core of the Bengali society. Just before midnight, the heavy steel gates of the Dhaka cantonment swung open. Columns of M24 Chaffee tanks, armored personal carriers, and thousands of heavily armed troops rolled into the sleeping city. The silence of the night was shattered by the deafening roar of diesel engines and the heavy thud of artillery fire. Their first targets were the centers of Bengali consciousness. The military surrounded the student dormitories of Dhaka University, specifically Jagannath Hall and Iqbal Hall. They did not attempt to arrest the students. They brought up recoilless rifles and heavy machine guns, firing directly into the brick buildings before storming the rooms. Professors were dragged from their quarters and executed in the courtyards. The very academics, poets, and students who had kept the language and culture alive were systematically slaughtered in the dark. Simultaneously, armored units assaulted the headquarters of the East Pakistan Rifles at Pilkhana and the Rajarbagh police lines. The Bengali officers, realizing they were being targeted for extermination by their own army, broke into their armories. Armed with antiquated bolt-action rifles, they engaged in desperate, fierce firefights against tanks and heavy artillery, fighting until they were completely out of ammunition and overrun. As the sky over Dhaka glowed a terrifying apocalyptic orange from the burning slums and university buildings, a commando unit arrived at Dhanmondi 32. Sheikh Mujibur Rahman had refused to flee. He was arrested and taken into military custody. But mere hours before the commandos kicked down his door, a pre-recorded message from Mujib was transmitted via a clandestine radio transmitter by the fleeing officers of the EPR. It was a brief, crackling transmission that echoed out into the darkness of the Bay of Bengal, declaring the definitive independence of Bangladesh. When the sun rose on March 26, the city of Dhaka was a smoking, blood-soaked ruin. The American Consul General in Dhaka, Archer Blood, watched from the roof of his consulate in horror, drafting a frantic, deeply classified telegram to Washington. He described not a military operation, but what he termed a selective genocide. The military junta believed that by cutting off the head of the movement, the body would simply die of shock. They believed that maximum overwhelming terror would force the Bengalis back into submission. It was the greatest miscalculation in the history of the subcontinent. They had not crushed the rebellion. By forcing the population to look down the barrel of a tank, they had simply ensured that every single survivor in the East Pakistan now knew that they would either have to fight or they would have to die. The political rallies were over. The bloodbath had begun. And the borders of India were about to be tested by the largest human migration since the partition of 1947.